Hey class, how are you doing? This is, I believe, our last lecture, and it is entitled Evidence-Based Practice. This is probably the biggest part of this entire semester, or this entire class. Evidence-based practice is essentially like a tripod. There's three aspects to it, and really in this class we've mostly focused on just the best research evidence. But in this lecture, I'm going to try to review a couple of past concepts, um, touch on a few more biases that we kind of went through with our like logical fallacies and all of that type of stuff. Just a couple more that I think are really relevant for us to cover. Um, but I'm going to review those, then I'm going to talk just ever so slightly on clinical expertise and patient values and things like that. And then I will give uh, essentially the steps to an evidence-based practice because it is a stepwise process. And essentially, if you follow, it's more or less like a circular framework. And if you follow it, then it's not 100% perfect, but it's effectively the best that we can do because, we live in somewhat of an imperfect world. So here we go with this. So just reviewing this evidence-based practice concept again, here are the three aspects to it, and I'm going to talk about all of them probably in the order of clinical expertise, patient values, then touch on best research evidence one more time. But well, here I'm just going to read this to you. It's a process by which you make decisions using best available evidence, and that's effectively our hierarchy of research. Clinical expertise, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Fairly tied to experience, and some individuals would call it intuition, even though I don't think that that's a great way of thinking about it. I do think that we should distrust our intuitions most of the time, but that's one of my biases. And patient preferences or patient values or patient expectations or something like that. Something to do with kind of the two-way street of what you think and what the patient thinks and what they are actually willing or unwilling to do. So let's go ahead and get into this a little bit, starting off with clinical expertise. So here, this is a quotation out of a uh, recent paper in 2018. So it was, if you want to read the whole paper, it's actually really interesting. But they're effectively talking about how to, or, well, I guess they're defining clinical expertise. So I'm just going to read this to you so that you don't have to read it yourself. By individual clinical expertise, we mean the proficiency and judgment that individual clinicians acquire through clinical experience and clinical practice. Increased expertise is reflected in many ways, but especially in more effective and efficient diagnosis and in the more thoughtful identification and compassionate use of individual patients, predicaments, rights, and preferences in making clinical decisions about their care. So this whole idea of clinical expertise is more or less the longer that you've been in a particular field or done just about anything, there's only so many ways that somebody can do something incorrectly or kind of cause a problem. So whenever you've seen somebody have a problem, and you've seen this 10,000 times or so, or 100 times or 10 times, then you're a little bit quicker, or you more rapidly can see what they're doing incorrectly. So, like, taking myself, for example, uh, I, I've I had been a personal trainer for a very long period of time, and I had, done various like uh, uh, weight training, like cardio, like all sorts of different things. So at the tail end of my personal training, well, so-called career, I guess, if I saw somebody doing a squat movement or a bench press or a lat pull down or anything like that, I had seen, you know, hundreds of people do it incorrectly, and whenever I would see someone start doing something incorrectly, I could identify what the problem was and cut it off right there, um, just because I had seen it so many times. So it's not so much like an intuition, it's just like I've seen this problem so many times, so I know how to solve it before it gets all the way to its end. It's almost like developing, I guess, mental shortcuts to where you can see like where something is heading. Well, I'm sure that many of you have friends, right? And whenever they start speaking, they might begin a statement, and you already know where that statement goes. So you can finish their sentences for them in many cases, and that's just because you've heard them say that sentence or say that story so many times. That's essentially what clinical expertise is, except it has more implications within, like, say, like our healthcare, fitness, whatever field that we're actually going in, for example. So that's kind of a little bit of commentary on there. Now, this is circling back to a previous concept that that I hopefully addressed on the first day in our class. Um, but some problems with clinical expertise. So the first one being, a lot of times people think they're an expert long before they actually are an expert. And this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And like these two psychologists, Dunning and Kruger, they figured out that whenever people had just a tiny bit of knowledge within a field, they were overly confident in that knowledge. So this is the idea that just a little bit of knowledge is more dangerous than a lot of bit of knowledge, and it's really within our kind of physical fitness, healthcare, nutrition, all sorts of different things like that. The Dunning-Kruger effect is such a massive thing because well, like I teach nutrition here, and I've taught nutrition for a pretty long time. And that field, out of just about any other field, people have a little bit of knowledge in, and like everyone should, because we all eat food, right? But almost all of the time, that little bit of knowledge makes them overly confident in what they think and or know about nutrition. And as a teacher, it is, I'm not saying it's impossible for me to recorrect that, but it's quite a bit of a barrier. But, you know, overall, this whole Dunning-Kruger problem is effectively whenever people begin to research something or to think about something, then they immediately think that they're an expert. So the biggest problem with clinical expertise is not being suspicious enough of yourself to where you realize that, like there's so much that I don't know. And that's really why I show you this graph and how I think it's so important for us to just read truthfully endless amounts of research. I mean, there's more research published basically every day. And the more information that you read, the more that you're, well, more suspicious of yourself. And yeah, I don't know. I guess that's just kind of an important thing. But that is a huge problem with clinical expertise. Another one, and this is kind of a two-part problem in many ways, is the availability heuristic, or called availability bias. So I'm going to read this to you. It's a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind when evaluating a specific topic, concept, method, or decision. So this availability heuristic, more or less what this means is it's just what you can remember. And we tend to remember our hits rather than our misses, and we tend to think that things uh, work better than they typically do. So uh, the really the issue here is you're more or less limited to your own experiences and your own memories. And all of us, we've only seen a narrow slice of reality, so that is somewhat of a problem. That's why it's important to go out, have more experiences and more information, read more research, so you have more things to draw from. Now, this availability heuristic leads to something called the survivorship bias. So this right here, it's a logical error of concentrating on the people or things that made it past some selection process and overlooking those that did not. Um, so within the realm of, say, diet, for example, as many of you know, I've done quite a bit of research on no carbohydrate, low carbohydrate, Atkins, ketogenic, that type of diet. And my availability heuristic shows that anybody that I've worked with tended to have a good response from it. But then what I really need to do is go read more research and look at the attrition rates, meaning people that dropped out or couldn't follow the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet or whatever, and realize how many people are lost effectively. So really what this means is that, well, of course, like any anecdote or person saying that they had a good response to a particular diet, a training program, whatever, they survived something and were able to persist on in that area. The biggest problem with most diets is most people can't do them for a long period of time. So whenever we have like diet or nutrition research, the survivorship is actually selecting for people that are able to have a dietary change and persist with it. So that's more selecting for a particular type of person, more so. Um, yeah, that's more or less what I want you to understand from there. But those problems with clinical expertise, first off, people think they're more of an expert than they are, and another one, we're limited by what we know or what we've seen, and that leads to a survivorship bias. Now, this next aspect of it, so done with clinical expertise, let's go ahead and move on to patient values and expectations. So here, let's just define this in some way. So value, it's a degree of importance of something or action, and expectation is a strong belief that something will happen or be the case in the future. So down here in this, I don't know, like just on the slide, not so much in the bottom right-hand corner, this is something called the self-regulatory theory, and this has, within psychology, and in particular exercise psychology, has implications in how people do goal setting and what their outputs or actions are. So if you follow on through this, what it is we have some type of input or new info, and think about it this way. People go to a doctor, say they don't weigh themselves or they don't pay attention to their health or something like that. And the doctor tells them that they're overweight, their blood sugar's too high, their cholesterol is out of order, whatever type of thing. Then they have something that they compare themselves to, and most of us humans, due to social desirability bias, we think that we're good or above average or something like that. So whenever there's new info that essentially tells us something contrary to what we believed, we compare to something idealized or what we think that we ought to be or whatever. And that leads to some type of output or action. So if, say someone's overweight, they're told that they're overweight, they view themselves as being a normal weight or whatever, then they will go out and exercise or eat more broccoli or whatever. And then there's some type of effect on the environment. But look on up here, this reference value or goal, if we have a particular goal that we want to meet or something that we want to do and or look like, then that will alter what we compare ourselves to. And this is a big problem that whenever I was a personal trainer, I dealt with all the time. And it's effectively, I'm going to call it the problem of false expectations or false comparators. So this is where individuals frequently will compare themselves to, I don't know, say like a supermodel or some celebrity or whatever. And this right here kind of ties into our availability heuristic. Like whenever we see people on, say, Instagram or whatever, we tend to think that that's normal. And, well, I mean, no, like that is by definition abnormal. It's like whenever people post pictures of themselves or other individuals or what have you, that's the best possible picture that they could put up, otherwise they wouldn't do it, right? So, so right here, this is just an example of whenever I was a personal trainer, I would have an individual come up to me and say that they wanted to look like X or Y supermodel or fitness model or whatever, and so they would bring a picture to me and say, hey, I want to look like this. And the person might not have the genetics, bone structure, or really mental fortitude to go through the process to look like X or Y person. So I would frequently show them this, that the schedule of an individual that might look like a supermodel or a fitness model or whatever. So like if we look at this right here, they wake up 2 cups of coffee or some type of thermogenic aid, whatever. They would do a stair stepper, eat an egg white omelet. They might answer some emails, they might walk their dog, they might do some resistance training, then they might have a protein shake, then later on they might have lunch, which is just like chicken breast, have a sweet potato and some asparagus, then they might run some errands, then they might have a snack of Greek yogurt or whatever, I don't know, cool like Instagram stuff people are into these days. Then they might do an elliptical again, then they might have a dinner of salmon, salad, salmon salad, right, my bad, kale and quinoa, then they might have free time, then they might pass out and repeat it all over again on a day in and day out basis. And unless an individual is willing to do something that drastic, well, like maybe they can't do something that drastic because they have kids, they have like friends, they like beer too much, who knows what it could possibly be. But that goes into our whole problem of whenever we see a particular person that we're inundated with that information, we start thinking that that's normal. And with patient values, that's one of the biggest problems, is trying to get people to correct or alter their values. And that leads into this next slide, where I think it's really important for all of us to read enough research. And this came out in one of our case reports. Like, what was the response of one particular individual on, say, a weight loss program or whatever? So this right here, I just made up some data, like time point 1, time point 2, weight change over time. People are doing whatever. So if we're looking at this, this is just weight in pounds, and each one of these is a different person. Now this solid black line, that's the average. So if we only paid attention to the average, over a certain course of time, somebody might lose 1.5 pounds. But there's a very big variance or standard deviation right here. Now, whenever we're reading research, most of the time only averages are reported. And that can be misleading in a lot of different ways because we have a wide variation in response to different things. And this is mostly because there's so many confounding variables within genetics, lifestyle, just really whatever. And uh, the reason that we try to pay attention to all of this is so that we can educate people and say, okay, if you do X or Y program, uh, you will, on average, lose 1.5 pounds plus or minus 6.28 pounds. Now, that sounds crazy. To me, it does, at least, because that is a very wide variance. Meaning, like, if we look at some people, like this person right here starting at, what was it? 190 something. Where did that go? Oh, 198 to 184, yes. So this person lost 14 pounds. So that person would be what is called a hyper-responder, whereas some people had like a negative response. This person gained 6 pounds. So being aware of like how data works, it's like, okay, well, like you could gain 6 pounds or you could lose 14 pounds if you follow this. That's like the variation in whatever program that this is. And keep in mind, I made all of this data up, but actually a lot of data looks like this. Like some people are non-responders, some people are adverse responders. There was a particular researcher, Claude Bouchard, who showed that individuals undertaking a endurance cycling program, not all of them got healthier. Some of them, their blood pressure got worse, which that does happen. It's really rare, but it is possible, and that's the more information like that we can get into our head, we can educate individuals on what are like reasonable expectations or reasonable goals or what is actually possible. Because, I mean, like, what's the likelihood that someone walks into your office and is going to be a hyper responder to whatever thing that you're doing? Not very likely. But also, it's not very likely they're going to be an adverse responder either. So there's just some information with that. And one of the biggest things with patient values is, and this comes a lot from my exercise psychology background, is almost all of the time you're trying to get people to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. And this, if you're interested in going further in things like this, this was a book that I read, and it's called Influence the Psychology of Persuasion by a man named Robert Cialdini. This book is, I think, one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. But it's effectively, how do you get people to do things in different ways? And Robert Cialdini, really big deal researcher, smart human being, he found that there's effectively like 6 different principles in order to get people to do things that they don't want to do. And, well, within the healthcare field, well, like, how are we going to get people to eat broccoli, go for more walks, do push-ups, like whatever you want people to do, right? Like, so many things are effective. There's these 6 key principles: reciprocity, commitment, and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, scarcity. So a few of these apply a little bit better than other ones. Reciprocity, more or less, that means if you do something for them, they will do something for you. And this actually goes back to like Benjamin Franklin, where what he found was if there's somebody who doesn't like you, and, well, Benjamin Franklin wasn't a researcher, but he wrote about this. If there's somebody who doesn't like you, if you ask them to do a small favor, a tiny favor for you, like lend you a pen, I can't think of any small favors, but anything really. If they do a small favor for you, that will create a cognitive dissonance in their brain to where they start thinking, wait, I must like them, otherwise I wouldn't do this positive thing for them. And that kind of leads into one of these other ones, liking. If you can just make someone like you, then they will tend to do a little bit more for you. And just think about this. Like, we all have friends, or at least all of you do. If we have friends and we have, I don't know, kind of a ranking system, like certain ones that we like more, certain ones we like less. Like, some of them, if they call you at like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. to pick them up, certain ones you would do anything for, other ones not so much, because conceivably you like them less. But those are those two. Commitment and consistency. Something with that. If you have an individual make their commitments and goals public, then they're more likely to actually do it. So I've had individuals in the past that I worked with, and I made them write a note to their spouse saying that they will exercise a certain amount of times per week. And whenever they made that public to their spouse, that actually made their exercise rate go up quite a bit because, well, they didn't want to be seen as they don't follow what they say or anything like that. Social proof. This one is more or less like you end up doing what other people do. So that's where with, say, exercise, for example, individuals that join, like, I don't know, cycling clubs or running clubs or join some type of group, if you're around other people that a particular behavior starts appearing as normal, then you're more likely to do it. This next one, authority. This is effectively why we're getting degrees and certifications and all sorts of things like that. If you appear to have like higher amounts of authority, then people will more likely do what you say. That's why it's important to dress professionally and display your credentials. There's actually one particular study that found with physical therapists that if they presented their degrees and accolades like in their office, that their patients were more likely to follow through with everything that they told them to do compared to individuals who, compared to physical therapists that did not display their degrees. So get your degree, dress professionally, and present yourself in that type of way. Scarcity, that one might have an application to what I'm talking about, but nothing really comes to my mind so much right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into these 6 steps. So with these steps of an evidence-based practice, there's a few different ways to remember this. And I don't want anyone to get confused. Here on the right-hand side, this shows 5 steps, but on the left-hand side, it shows 6. And I do want you to know the 6 steps. But it maps on fairly well with this kind of graphical representation over here. And you could remember it with a certain amount of A's if you want to. So you ask a question, you acquire information, you appraise the situation, you apply the information, and then you audit. Really meaning evaluate, change, all sorts of things like that. But you can read through that if you want to. Overall, here are the 6 steps. So you ask a question or develop a particular question that you're trying to get the answer to. And it could be something as simple as, what's the best way to lose weight? Or what's the best way to increase your bench press? Or jump higher? Or, I don't know, like increase your, angular velocity so that you can twirl better whenever you're doing flips. Or a triple axel, or whatever. It can be anything. Then you need to search for the evidence, you need to evaluate the evidence, and then you need to incorporate the evidence into practice and confirm the evidence in one individual. So this is why we always try to do it in one person before we start applying it to a lot of people to essentially get some level of proof that, like it actually works. And then we reevaluate the evidence and then maybe develop another question, or we refine our question, or whatever from there. So the first part, I think this is funny. But in developing a question or asking a question, it's important to start as broad as you possibly can. And a lot of us don't realize that this is actually the value of education or reading textbooks or encyclopedias or coming to classes and lectures to give you essentially the basic tools to then go forward and be able to ask more specific questions and to give you enough information in your brain that, like we have essentially different examples and counterexamples that we can actually pull from. So whenever we start coming into contact with a problem, maybe we go back to one of our chapters, or heck, even Wikipedia. Like, go to the Wikipedia page, read the entire page, and then see what comes after that. So we need to start broad, consult textbooks, encyclopedias, get a sense of how something works first. And then we can start developing a little bit more of a question. Because quite frequently, how things are written in research papers is not exactly how it's going to show up in like common speech and things. So I don't know, like take something like the stretch reflex, like how muscle spindles work. In some cases, it might be called the myotatic reflex. And yeah, you might get very different results if you search one thing versus a different thing. Here's one that actually came up in my mind recently whenever I was answering an email. Someone was interested in intermittent fasting, which is just the idea of you restrict the amount of time that you eat. So you do like a 16-hour fast and an 18-hour feed-in window. So you get all of your calories, macronutrients, proteins, meals, whatever, within 8 hours. And the other 16 hours, you're just fasting, not eating. And if you look around in the research, if you do intermittent fasting, you'll probably come away with things like alternate day fasting, meaning like you eat whatever you want on a particular day. The next day you don't eat at all. And then the day after that you eat whatever you want. Then the day after that you eat nothing at all, so on and so forth. Wash, rinse, repeat, however that works. And that might not be what you're actually looking for. But if you do some cursory reading, then you would realize, intermittent fasting in research is frequently called time-restricted eating or time-restricted feeding. And then you refine your search terms to reflect that. And then you will be able to find information that is more closely resembling the question that you're interested in or question that you're asking. And really this development of a question, that's why it's important to read broadly. And truthfully, like within my so-called clinical expertise, this is one of my better areas is, I've just read enough to where I know a lot of words that are going to show up in research papers. So there we go with that. The next thing, searching for evidence. And this one of our first lectures addressed all of this. So our location of research lecture. Google Scholar, PubMed, the library, different stuff like that. I mean, I don't know. I think that's simple, basic, obvious. But just knowing where to find things and, peer-reviewed, rigorously studied information, that's effective. effectively where we begin. And if it's not there, then, well, okay. We shouldn't take it that much. Um, so here, let's say I'm dealing with a problem, and this is just Google Scholar, right? I'm dealing with a problem. I'm interested in type 2 diabetes, as I talk about quite a bit, and um, diet. Like you could look up something like this, type 2 diabetes and diet meta-analysis, and check that out. So many things come up that are actually really interesting. So first one, sugar-sweetened beverages, which sugar-sweetened beverages, if you don't know, that is a term for sodas, Cokes, uh, um, really just about any carbonated fluid that's got a lot of sugar in it. So like um, not Diet Coke because that is a artificial sweetener in it, but yeah, here we go with that. Well, truthfully, reading all of these would be very beneficial for us. So like that's just an example of how to do that. Next thing, evaluating the evidence, and this really goes back to our hierarchy of scientific evidence. And I don't know, I've talked about this so many times. I'm sure that it's getting boring to you. Which that's fine. I like the more boring this gets, the more it gets beaten into your head. Very happy about that. So here, case reports, opinion papers, letters, animal trials, all the way up to RCTs and meta-analyses. Now, within that, we can't just be comfortable with those because, as I've shown you in class, individuals will frequently cite things incorrectly or improperly and no one double check them. So a meta-analysis or a systematic review, you have to go back and look at what they cited, or maybe there's problems with randomized control trial. They didn't follow enough confounding variables. Or they just something could have possibly been done incorrectly, or the magnitude of the results or effects is really small. And even though it's really powerful, then, or even though it's really consistent, it might not be very powerful. Well, like here's one thing that I remember reading. The effect of birth order on IQ. So IQ, intelligence quotient, hopefully everybody has heard of that at least once or twice in your life. The reliability of the data is a firstborn has a reliably higher IQ than a secondborn. So that might be, an interesting finding. However, whenever I tell you that magnitude of the effect, it is by 1 IQ point. So if one person has 100 IQ, their older brother or sister has a 101 IQ. And if anybody knows much about IQ research, if it's not at least 10 or 15 higher, you don't notice. it's really a wash. There. So here right, okay. So if I'm looking at my research for developing this research question or whatever, a systematic review and meta-analysis, I'm looking at a particular diet that is going to be the best at dealing with type 2 diabetes. This one right here, this is the top because it is coming into contact with diet, type 2 diabetes, and it's a meta-analysis, so that's pretty great. Now, incorporating the evidence into practice, now that we have information, we have to do something with it. And I remember hearing once that the difference between knowledge and wisdom is knowing how to apply the information. So a wise person knows how to apply information better. That really has nothing to do with our class, but I don't know, I think it's interesting nonetheless. But here, the thinker, the doer, if hopefully that is somewhat interesting. But we have to do something with that information. Then we move on to step 5, which is confirming the evidence in a particular individual. So based on the patient values and what they pick, and educating them on things like trying to get their comparator or their goal in line with what is actually possible or consistent or whatever. Then we monitor their weight. Hopefully they go to a doctor, whatever. We have a program with one individual, and this is a really slow process. You have to do things in one person before we move on to a bunch of other people, right? So that's effectively what's going on there. And then lastly, after we get data on one person, then maybe from that it was a learning experience to where we figure out more things. And it's like, oh, but I need to ask this particular type of question. Like saying this type 2 diabetes thing, if we came across with a low carbohydrate diet being the best idea for them, okay, yes, a low carbohydrate diet, that's cool, but then what type of fats should they be eating? Or what type of protein should they be eating? Or a low carbohydrate diet plus what type of exercise would be the best? And then we end up gathering more data and refining the question into getting something completely new than what we began with. And overall, like, those are the 6 steps to an evidence-based practice. And I don't know. I guess the biggest things from this class that I really want anybody to understand or know is, well, just go Google Scholar and read a lot more about anything, and like read things that aren't even related to what you're interested in a lot of the time, just so that you have more information to pull from in your head, right? And also be suspicious of what you think. I like that whole Dunning-Kruger effect. Almost anybody who thinks they're an expert probably isn't. And well, like say in the media or whatever, whenever someone's talking about a particular topic, that's not always the smartest or most worthy person of doing that. It's frequently the loudest person doing that. So I don't know, like pay attention to those types of things, and shoot me an email if you have any questions. And I believe that is it.